For 11 years, one man controlled a weapons pipeline that stretched across 3 countries, moved enough firearms to arm a small militia, and never once saw the inside of a courtroom. Every agency that tried to touch him walked away empty-handed, and along the way, he made no shortage of enemies. Every informant he ever suspected disappeared before they could testify. He trusted exactly 4 people in his entire life, and he trusted one of them completely, more than his own brothers, more than the men who had bled for him. That was his only mistake, because the man he trusted most had been building a case against him since the day they met, and by the time the doors came down, it wasn't a shootout that ended the empire. It was a single folder of evidence, handed over by the last person anyone expected. Stick around, because the way this actually ends will change how you see every person in this story. Vincent Moretti didn't look like a man who moved weapons across borders for a living. He looked like someone's uncle, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. That was exactly the point. By the time he was 40, Moretti had built one of the most efficient illegal arms networks on the East Coast, using shell companies, fishing routes, and a small fleet of shipping containers that officially carried machine parts and unofficially carried something far more dangerous. He didn't sell to just anyone. That was his rule, and it was also his cover. Moretti positioned himself as careful, even principled, which made law enforcement's job harder. There was no sloppy trail of angry buyers or botched deals. Every transaction moved through layers of intermediaries so thick that even his own lieutenants only ever saw one piece of the operation. He kept the full picture in his head and nowhere else. For over a decade, that made him untouchable. But an empire built entirely on one man's memory has exactly one point of failure, and in the 11th year, that point of failure got closer to him than anyone ever had. His name, as far as Moretti knew, was Daniel Reyes. He showed up at the right time, through the right introduction, vouched for by a supplier Moretti had used for years. Reyes was careful, sharp, and useful in exactly the ways that mattered. He solved a shipping problem in his first month that had cost Moretti 2 associates the year before. He never asked questions he didn't need to ask. He never overstepped. Slowly, over 18 months, Reyes became something Moretti hadn't allowed himself in a long time. Someone he didn't watch closely. Reyes handled logistics, then finances, then eventually sat in on meetings that only Moretti's inner circle attended. He was steady in a business built on people who weren't. He remembered birthdays. He drove Moretti's daughter to her college interview once, when nobody else was available. Trust, in Moretti's world, wasn't given. It was earned in small, boring, consistent moments over years, and Reyes earned it exactly that way, on purpose. One unremarkable act at a time. What Moretti never knew was that Daniel Reyes wasn't the man's real name, and every one of those small favors had been logged, timestamped, and filed the same night it happened. Undercover operations like this one aren't built on dramatic confrontations. They're built on patience, and patience was the one resource federal investigators had more of than Moretti did. For nearly 3 years, Reyes fed information upward, not in dramatic leaks, but in careful fragments. A shipping manifest here, a meeting location there. Enough to corroborate, never enough to expose himself. The case against Moretti wasn't built to catch him in the act of one crime. It was built to map the entire structure, every shell company, every route, every name that mattered, so that when the moment came, there would be no scattered pieces left behind for the organization to rebuild around. Reyes spent those years walking a line most people couldn't survive walking. He had to be useful enough to stay close and invisible enough to stay unsuspected, while quietly documenting a criminal network from inside its own walls. There were moments it nearly fell apart. A supplier once questioned why Reyes always seemed to have a reason to leave meetings early. Moretti brushed it off himself, vouching for the man personally. That single moment of trust from Moretti was the thing that kept the entire operation alive for another 18 months. He was, without knowing it, protecting the exact person building his downfall. By the 4th year, the case was airtight. Every shipment, every shell company, every account. What the investigators needed wasn't more evidence. It was the right moment, one where Moretti would be present, connected, and unable to claim distance from the operation the way he had for over a decade. Reyes arranged it without arranging anything that looked arranged. A routine meeting, the kind Moretti had attended hundreds of times before, at a warehouse he considered as safe as his own home. What Moretti didn't know was that Reyes had spent the previous 48 hours coordinating directly with federal agents, finalizing exactly when and how the operation would move. When the doors came down, Moretti's first instinct wasn't fear. It was confusion, because the last face he expected to see standing calmly beside the agents, badge now visible, was the one person in the room he'd never once doubted. Reyes didn't gloat. He didn't explain himself in some dramatic monologue. He simply nodded once, the same quiet nod he'd given 100 times before in ordinary meetings, and let the agents do the rest. Moretti didn't fight. There was nothing left to fight. The Empire hadn't fallen to a rival, or a raid, or bad luck. It had fallen to a folder Reyes had been building since the very first conversation they ever had. The trial moved faster than anyone in Moretti's old network expected, because there was almost nothing left to argue. Years of documentation, financial trails, and first-hand testimony left little room for the usual delays and dismissals that had protected him before. Moretti was convicted on nearly every count prosecutors brought forward, and the network that had taken over a decade to build unraveled within months, as associates who once trusted his judgment scrambled to distance themselves before the same evidence reached their own doorsteps. Reyes disappeared from the story almost as quietly as he'd entered it. There was no press conference, no public statement, no name attached to a headline. That was intentional. People who do this kind of work for a living don't get applause. They get a new identity and a quiet transition into whatever comes next. And most of the time, no one ever learns their real name at all. What's strange about this story isn't the weapons, or the trial, or even the fall of a man who thought he was untouchable. It's the years leading up to it, the birthdays remembered, the favors done, the ordinary trust built, one small moment at a time, by someone whose entire presence was a performance with a purpose. Moretti spent 11 years building an empire nobody could crack from the outside, and he never once considered that the crack was already inside, sitting across the table from him, driving his daughter to a college interview, nodding along in every meeting like he belonged there. And maybe that's the part of this story that should stay with you. Not how the empire fell, but how completely and for how long the person closest to him was never who he thought he was. That's where the story of this mafia boss ends. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe.